So we're going to call the committee back to order, Standing Committee for Climate Change and Environmental Stewardship. We're here on Thursday. We've had a couple of really insightful, informative days. We've had some good decorum, a lot of great presentations, some solid questioning from all four parties. First off today, we have appearing virtually, we have the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, Université de Moncton, appearing Céline Surette, Professor, and Luc Tremblay, Professor. Good morning. You'll have 20 minutes for your presentation. At the 15-minute mark, I'll put my hand up. I'm not sure you'll see it because of the virtual, so I might have to mention it in the microphone, and I won't mean to cut you off. I'll try to pick a good spot where there's some air in there and try my best not to cut you off anyway. And at that point, you'll have 5 minutes left. At the end of the 20-minute presentation, you'll have approximately 40 minutes of questioning, 10 minutes from each political party. And we're very excited that you're here. We're encouraged by it, and the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais...
Thank you. So first off, I would like to acknowledge that the territory where we are gathering are part of the traditional and unceded territory of Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy people. So thank you very much for hearing what we have to say today. My name is Céline Surette, and I'm Professor of Environmental Chemistry, and my expertise is on contaminants and the relationship between health and environment. And I will now ask my colleague to speak up. So my name is Luc Tremblay. I'm a professor of chemistry at the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. For 25 years, I've been working on organic matters in our environment, especially in aquatic environment. And I already worked on organic contaminants. So first off, Céline and myself would like to say that we are very concerned by the significant use of glyphosate in New Brunswick, especially in the forestry sector. But many things that we're going to see is going to apply to other pesticides and other forestry use. For example, in agriculture and domestic use. Céline and myself, we believe it's important that NB scientists participate in the debate by presenting data, and we hope that our expertise and our contribution today will help the committee in your reflections. So we thank you for this opportunity. So for those who don't know this already, I would like to talk about the toxicity of glyphosate and the mechanism. So how can glyphosate kill some organism? So some matters will use a certain way to produce amino acids, and those organisms will use a metabolic pathway. And glyphosate will block an enzyme that allows those acids to build those amino acids. And because it blocks those enzymes, then they cannot build amino acids, and they will kill quickly enough. They will be killed quickly enough. So the mechanism that use this are plants, and there are also many other microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, algae, and because humans do not use this metabolic pathway to build amino acids, the toxicity of glyphosate is lower for humans and animals. That being said, when we talk about acute toxicity, it's a short-term toxicity. So we can have long-term toxicity. This is not as well known, and Céline will talk about this later on. So what will be the glyphosate effects on natural environment? Well, some stakeholders talked about biodiversity, and I would just like to remind you of this. So the glyphosate's role is to eliminate plants at the base of food web and shelters. And this can also create, and this can create a long-term changes of the types of plants and animal species. So it's actually going to change this long-term. And what we know is that in cold climates, like our climate, glyphosate can stay in soil for more than 1 year. And what we also see in the literature is that glyphosate could also deplete soil nutrients because it can kill some organism that can be found in the soil. So we have the N fixation. So these are the only organism that can take nitrogen and they can transform it in other minerals. So if we kill those organisms, we could have a soil nutrients depletion. And there's also the fact that glyphosate can do minerals binding, organic matters, and also minerals. So if glyphosate kills those minerals, they will no longer be available. In the literature, we see that more research is needed on this topic, and we need to see what is the real impact on soil depletion. And there's another risk, and I'm not going to talk about this for a long time because it's not necessarily part of my research field, but recently, some experts are saying that by eliminating hardwood in our forestry sector, we will have stronger forest fires and they will expand more quickly and they will be more difficult to extinguish. So we think that this should be studied further, especially with climate change. We know that we will have more and more forest fires. So this is more my area of expertise, so I'm going to talk about the mobility of contaminants in the environment. So once the glyphosate is in the forest, can it be found in watercourse? So forestinfo.ca, this website, it says, due to the chemical structure of glyphosate, the product binds quickly to soil particles and it is very unlikely to leach into the soil and groundwater. So when we look at the literature, we can see that we find glyphosate in watercourse everywhere around the world. In our written document, I provided a table, and it's a literature review where we observed that we found glyphosate in North America, in Europe, and South America, and it was found in groundwater that was analyzed, and sometimes we can find high concentration of glyphosate, 430 micro per liters. So this is proof that glyphosate can move around in watercourses. So it's clear that in those studies, we don't know what is the glyphosate's contribution from agriculture and from the forestry sector, but it still shows that glyphosate can be found in watercourses. So what about in Canada? So this is a mandate from Environment Canada, but the latest report is from 2011 from Environment Canada. In this report, it says, and I quote, presence and levels of priority pesticides in selected Canadian aquatic ecosystems. Glyphosate is the active ingredient with the highest sales volume in 4 of the 5 regions surveyed in the National Water Quality Surveillance Program, and yet was only measured in 2 of the provinces, British Columbia and Ontario. And future surveillance activities should include glyphosate in all environmental media due to the high sales volume. And I received a confirmation yesterday that Environment Canada still does not measure glyphosate in Atlantic Canada. So for areas where it was measured in the report, we have British Columbia and the Fraser Valley. The report states the highest concentrations in runoff were measured for the herbicide glyphosate. Glyphosate's transformation product, AMPA, and the AMPA is also toxic and it was found in high concentration. So the range of concentrations, it's 2,000 to 9,000 ng a liter. So it's clear for us that regardless what some stakeholders have to say, it's clear that this glyphosate and other herbicides can be found in water. So the use that we do for glyphosate in the agriculture is not the same in the forestry sector, but the distribution mechanism in the environment will be the same. So it's true that glyphosate will be more retained by clay-rich and organic-rich soils. And in those soils, it can resist to degradation and persist for more than 1 year. So the mechanism that allow glyphosate to be leached in water, so the glyphosate will leach much more easily in sandy soils. And there's a part of glyphosate that is partly dissolved, because in chemistry there's also there's some substance that will like to stay solid, but there's always a part that will be soluble. And this is particularly true for glyphosate for the dissolved organic matters, because in the soil we have water, but we also have organic matters that are dissolved. So this will be moved easily. So if glyphosate can be associated to this matter, instead of staying in particles, it will be moved to watercourses. And there's also erosion by water and by wind, and erosion can transport particles enriched in glyphosate towards natural waters. That's another mechanism. And even if we're careful, aerial spraying of glyphosate allows its transport by wind towards surface waters, because the droplets can be carried by wind. And of course, we know that glyphosate is toxic for many aquatic species in the short term. So once it's an aquatic environment, it will have toxicity for many matters, for example, amphibians, algae, and now I will let Céline talk. Well, thank you, Luc. So, as my colleague just explained, we know that glyphosate can be found in the environment, but what about human health? So when we look at the risk of aerial spraying in the forestry sector, there are very few studies that exist. The only one that I found was one in Colombia, and it was shown that the aerial spraying will increase in medical consultations linked to dermatological problems, so skin problems, respiratory diseases, and there's also a relationship with the increase in miscarriage in this context. And I also found a study, and it was in 2009, and it shows that small rural population exposed to aerial spraying, there's a higher concentration in their urine. So these are small rural population because it's in the forestry sector. So it's very difficult to have strong epidemiological studies on population. So we need to recognize that we do not have a lot of information, and we don't know the human health effects of this aerial spraying, but we are all exposed to glyphosate, and we see this in the literature. So we can detect glyphosate in urine of all studied populations. Every time we studied the concentration, it was possible to detect it. And we will see that we will detect this more and more because the detection mechanism improved over time. It can go up to 90% of the population. It doesn't mean that it goes over the standards, but it still means that we are exposed. What's also interesting to see in the literature is that there was a study that was done in California, and it was on the agriculture sector workers. So we compare the population between 1993 to 2014 to 2016, and there's a 5 times increase in urine glyphosate between the start of the 90s and the beginning of around 2015. So this goes with the increase of aerial spraying glyphosate around the world. So there is historical evidence of exposure in agricultural environments. So we started to use it in the 1970s. It really increased afterwards, and it keeps increasing. What we also see in the literature is that the higher concentration for humans are for agricultural workers. So, because this is exposure through eating food, for example. So when we talk about effects on human health, I talked about some impacts. So what about diseases? So we talk about cancer a lot regarding glyphosate, and we know that in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. This is very controversial, and since then, several regulatory agencies have revised their position to say that it is probably not carcinogenic. For example, the Health Agency in Canada, but this international agency maintains this position. So there is no consensus on this. It really depends on which studies we look at and how we consider the different research that are published. In 2019, there was a meta-analysis that was published, and it suggests that we would have an increased risk, especially for non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And we also know that it's the same disease. And oh, you have 5 minutes left. Okay, thank you. So a court case was won in 2019. And actually, it was sustained in May 2021, and this was recognized. So this is a court case. It's not the same thing as a scientific literature review. So that's for cancer. So there's no scientific consensus. There are other diseases that can also be related to glyphosate, and there's a lot of uncertainty around the Crohn's disease. So we know that glyphosate is capable of modifying intestinal microbiome in rat assessment needed in humans, especially children. And young rats are more affected than older rats. So we really need to study this amongst humans, and especially children. And there are other health issues to study. Respiratory diseases, for example, skin problems, respiratory diseases, reproductive system issues, and I would be very pleased to answer all of your questions about that. So in Canada, we have very few Canadian studies that will allow us to understand the effects of glyphosate on the human population. So the Canadian Health Measures Survey measured 279 different contaminants, but not the glyphosate. A study by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency finds that 30% of food contained traces of glyphosate, but little exceeded established health standards. But this exists, and it is up to 50% in the grains. And this is one crop where we use glyphosate the most. So in fact, although glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide in the world, there are very few large-scale studies on exposure on health effects. And different researchers say that we need more comprehensive epidemiological studies are needed to confirm the glyphosate safety for humans and to provide recommendations and guidelines to regulate its use. When we talk about health, it's important to look at determinants of health. I do not want to talk about this for too long, but when we look at health, we really need to look at this globally and the complex interactions between health, the environment, and the community, the different socioeconomic factors, and the general environment. So it's important to understand the combined effects, and we need to use the precautionary principle because absolute evidence is really difficult to obtain. So this is the part where we do our recommendations, and I will let my colleagues speak to this. So our first recommendation, given our presentation, the knowledge we have, and that we think that glyphosate, like all pesticides, should be used minimally in an ad hoc manner in time and space, limited time and space, and when other solutions are not possible. New Brunswick is the province with the largest proportion of its territory that is treated with glyphosate in forestry. And given the fact that glyphosate can be replaced by other economically viable solutions, Quebec banned aerial spraying of herbicides in forests in 2001, and the Maine legislature has just approved such a ban. And given the fact that we have a lack of knowledge on human health impacts and the concentration of glyphosate that are found in watercourses in New Brunswick, we recommend that aerial spraying cease in New Brunswick. It doesn't seem that this practice is prudent and well advised. In addition to this recommendation, we also think that we need to have strategic environmental impact assessments and a cumulative impact assessment to have a full picture of this issue on the forestry sector and the agricultural sector. And it's also very important to have environmental impact assessments that would be done independently by the Chief Medical Officer of Health's office. And as it was shown in our presentation, no monitoring is done for glyphosate. So we need to add glyphosate and other pesticides to the list of indicators that are monitored by the Department of Environment and Local Government, especially for the water quality in New Brunswick's lakes and rivers, but also for human health. And finally, we couldn't finish this presentation by adding this next recommendation. I think it was shown many times throughout the presentation. We need more research. We don't have enough research to fully understand the glyphosate's impacts on our environment and human health in the globally and also in New Brunswick. So we need to fund this research, and we need to ask for more research to better understand our standards and adapt our standards if needed. So we would like to thank you for your attention, and we'll be very pleased to answer all of your questions. And we also want to thank the interpreters because we know that we spoke a bit too quickly. So thank you.
It was insightful. First up, we're going to have the official opposition. Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Premièrement, je veux merci.
Well, first off, I would like to thank the two professors for your great presentation. A lot of great information. It was quick and many things to digest in a short period of time. So you will need to understand that I do have some questions, but we might not have the time to ask all of our questions between myself and my colleagues. So Mr. or Dr. Tremblay, you talked about the glyphosate toxicity in the forestry sector. So in terms of aerial spraying, what are the studies showing in the short term? So the first 2 years after aerial spraying, and also medium term, from 3 to 5 years, and also the long-term impacts of the toxicity following aerial spraying. Could you provide us with more information on that topic? Okay, so it's clear that in the short term, it says pesticides. So the glyphosate's role is to kill. It's not to kill animals or humans. Yes, we can all agree on that. So glyphosate is very toxic for certain types of organisms. So I mentioned plants, especially deciduous trees. Especially if there's aerial spraying, the absorption is done by leaves. So that's why it's toxic. So in the short term, it's clear that when we do aerial spraying in the forestry sector, we're going to kill all the organisms. So the scientific answer to your question is that all organisms that use this metabolic pathway that I talk about in my report, so the way that we can build some amino acids, if the organism uses this metabolic pathway, they will be killed. So in the short term, we're going to kill mostly grasses, deciduous trees, plants, and microorganisms that use this metabolic pathway. In the medium term and in the long term, what happens with glyphosate and all the other pesticides, we have glyphosate found everywhere in the environment. One part is degraded quickly enough, but one part remains for a long time. One part will leach through water. So you need to understand that in the beginning, what happens is that glyphosate, it's kept in the soil. It's trapped there. And then in the soil, we have water. So there's a part of the glyphosate that will leach in water. So in my mind, there is no doubt about this, regardless of the fact that glyphosate likes to bind to other particles, there's still a part that will be leached into water. So once it's in water, it can move around, it can migrate. So then we can find it in our groundwater, regardless what forestinfo.ca will say. So we can find glyphosate concentration in groundwater everywhere in the world. So this is the proof that glyphosate can move around, and it remains long enough to be found in water streams, and then we can have many impacts. So now it's not in kill mode. To kill, we need significant concentration. So then glyphosate is found in the environment in much lower concentration, but we can find it everywhere. And that's where it becomes very subtle, and we don't know exactly what happens. What happens with glyphosate in very low concentration, a little bit everywhere in the environment? Some studies show that it will have impacts on algae, for example, in waterways. Some studies show that amphibians that are more fragile will also be impacted by glyphosate. So I didn't read all the literature on this topic and all the studies, but a concern remains. And for human health, Céline can maybe add something to this, but what happens is that glyphosate is everywhere. So glyphosate can be found in our waterways, in our food. So what are the impacts on health? So it becomes complicated and complex. So those impacts are not easy to see quickly. And many diseases can appear, and maybe Céline can talk about this further, but many diseases come from the environment, some things we didn't see 50 years ago, for example. So could it be a combination of all of those matters that didn't exist in nature and the environment? So these small concentrations in organisms, it will have impacts on our global health, and it's very difficult to study all of those factors, and we don't have enough data. I have other questions. So I have two other questions, actually, and thank you for your answer. In your report, we say that there's a high level of concentration in humans' urine level and so on. So did you conduct any research on the agricultural sector? What are the common practices? Are they followed properly in terms of aerial spraying and the quantity used? So did you conduct any research on aerial spraying of glyphosate in the agriculture sector? And do you have any scientific data or percentages to provide us? So the quantity used in the agricultural sector and the forestry sector, because we know that we have much more land in the agricultural sector that use this type of pesticide. So did you conduct any research on this topic?
In New Brunswick, we're not following global guidelines. In the world, 90% of glyphosate is used in agriculture, specifically for GMOs. So grains that can resist to glyphosate, and there is a spraying program throughout the forestry program. In New Brunswick, we use it less in agriculture. So it's forestry that concerns us. And for industrial use, especially under power lines. So that's the first part of our answer. Then, the second part of the answer would be this. What happened over time is that because of these genetically modified seeds, we increased the concentration or the spraying of glyphosate. So we're giving a program to farmers, and then they'll apply glyphosate at various moments throughout the season. So it's no longer a pesticide that's used to solve a problem that emerges. It becomes a systematic application program. It's used because that's the formula. So in our eyes, this is problematic. Excellent, thank you. I have another question, if you will. You mentioned many recommendations, both of you. Thank you very much. In terms of timelines, in one of your recommendations, you say that New Brunswick is the one who uses the most glyphosate in forestry on its territory, and you recommend that glyphosate should be used minimally and in an ad hoc manner, and only when other solutions are not possible. So I would like to know, do you recommend a deadline to finding alternatives to this product? Or other alternatives? Well, I would be uncomfortable with that. Everything that has to do with forestry is not my area of expertise. I looked at the agenda and I see that you have witnesses from the forestry industry that would be better able to answer this question than me. I think that there are other areas that have banned glyphosate in forests, at least aerial spraying. The lumber industry has not crumbled in Quebec since 2001, so there must be other solutions, but I don't have any expertise in this area. Understood. Okay, so my last question, it's about this mysterious disease that we've seen in New Brunswick. Have you done any studies on this? Have you been mandated to do some exhaustive research on this? What can you tell us? There's not much we can say about this disease, this unknown disease. It's a very complex issue, and there won't be a single cause that will suddenly appear. Neurologists have been trying to understand this for years. They've studied it with their patients to try and understand what exposures may have taken place. It would be difficult to say anything about the causes of this illness and to make a connection with pesticides or glyphosate today. I don't think that we've arrived at this point. We have to use more precautions and to try and understand it. I wouldn't want to say today that pesticides are the cause of this illness, especially because it's unknown and because these pesticides have been used the world over. But to answer your sub-question, no, we have not been asked to do any research on this. There are no studies that are looking at the link between glyphosate and this disease. I think any link between mysterious disease and pesticides would be hypothetical at this point. I don't see why there would be a connection at this time. Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers, and thank you again for your excellent presentation.
Mr. Kuhn?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci.
Thank you, Professor Surette and Tremblay, for your presentations. I will ask my questions in English because of the vocabulary. That's a little more complex and technical, so I will be asking my questions in English.
So I want to ask a little bit about timing, because some of the discussion has been around the persistence of the glyphosate in various types of environments. But when you look at some of the literature, for example, the recent paper, peer-reviewed, that was published in the Journal of Immunotoxicology by Professor Félix et Pelletier from the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Laval. They did an extensive review of impacts on animal health from the literature, and they found cellular effects, digestive effects, cerebral effects, cardiovascular effects, and reproductive effects. And Professor Surette, you mentioned, I believe, miscarriages in your presentation. And in fact, I found a paper that was published in Environmental Health Perspectives by researchers from Health Canada's Bureau of Reproductive and Child Health from 2001, where they were looking at the miscarriages and stillbirths with a variety of pesticides, including glyphosate, and they found a clear association for late miscarriages with exposure to glyphosate, but pre-conception exposure, so before conception. So I'm wondering, this suggests that the timing of exposure is an issue. It's not just that it persists at a certain time in the environment, perhaps, but the timing of a short-term exposure can have significant impacts. This is dealing with animal health in the one paper, but in the other paper with human health. So I wonder if you could comment on the timing of exposure for animals and humans in terms of what's at work there.
Yeah, that's. I'm not sure. Je vais répondre.
I will answer in French. For the same reasons as you, it's easier for me to find the technical terms. Yes, there are absolutely periods where there's a critical vulnerability to contaminants. I have not studied glyphosate in depth. I worked on heavy metals more. But we know that some heavy metals will have effects on the fetal development, and this in critical periods of development after birth. I do think that glyphosate has not been studied enough. We're starting to see studies on animal models that study cellular effects, and these studies show the effects in the cells. It's very clear in many studies that we have, but there have been very few studies on human populations that would allow us to truly understand what's happening with humans beyond epidemiologic studies, where we can see effects, but we don't have a good idea of when the exposure happened, so we would estimate when exposure happened, and this is an issue if you're trying to have clear results. But if we're thinking about vulnerable periods, I think that indeed there will be such periods, and we need to study this more. Another thing about the persistence of glyphosate, I think that this is something that's important to remember. When we use a pesticide so regularly and intensely, like we do with glyphosate, it means that there's always more entering the environment. So even if the pesticide degrades, there will always be more to replace it. So there could be effects in animals and exposed environments, just like we can have effects in people who are exposed to this pesticide. I hope that this answered the questions. I'm giving you a real scientist's answer, saying that we need more data and that we're unable to understand everything at this exact moment.
From other scientists who've presented to us as well, particularly given the costs of the kinds of long-term studies, both in the laboratory across generations of test organisms or in the field can be expensive. But sticking with the idea of time, here again, the other side of this is there are particular vulnerabilities in time for exposure. But the other field that has emerged recently is a field of epigenetic transgenerational inheritance. C'est la raison que je parle.
The reason I'm speaking English is for words like these.
Inheritance. So this is a case where exposure occurs, but there is no obvious toxicological effect on the organism exposed, or even their direct offspring, but in their grand offspring or great-grand offspring, you see significant toxicological effects. And there was a study published in 2019 looking at glyphosate in this way on, this was in the lab, looking at it on rats. And so pregnant rats were exposed to glyphosate, no impact on those pregnant rats, no impact that was discernible on their offspring. But when it came to their grandchildren, I guess, and great-grandchildren in the rat world, they saw increases in prostate disease, obesity, kidney disease, ovarian disease, and some other birth abnormalities. So this is again a question of time. Can you comment on are you familiar with this field, and can you comment on what the implications of this might be for spraying glyphosate?
Again, for glyphosate, I can't comment specifically, but this is true for other contaminants. We're seeing more and more of these studies that are studying epigenetics, and we'll see effects in subsequent generations. So grandchildren, great-grandchildren will experience effects that are connected to a grandmother's exposure. And to broaden the topic, there are also studies, you know, we live in a chemical age, and the contaminants evolve over time. So the contaminants that my grandmother was exposed to, or even my mother, are different than the ones that I'm exposed to. And they're different from the ones that my children are exposed to. And this is also connected when we think about intergenerational issues. The fact that we are affected by contaminants that evolve over time shows that we can have epigenetic differences that are overlapping with other exposures to other contaminants. And so it's extremely difficult to study because there are synergies and dynamics and mechanics that can be different, and diseases that would have different timelines in terms of the development of our systems in our body. They happen at different times. There are different periods of vulnerability throughout our lives. So this is an area that is embryonic right now, and that's why it's important to take precautions, especially when we are thinking about a contaminant that is very little studied but very widely used. Thank you, Dr. Surette.
Question for Dr. Tremblay, or Professor Tremblay, and that is, can you explain a little bit about the breakdown products of glyphosate? You mentioned it very quickly, a breakdown product, and it went by really fast. So could you explain what that is and how that persists, or if it does?
The only thing I know about this component, when microorganisms or even non-biological parameters that can degrade the molecule will be sensitive to certain changes. So the glyphosate can morph into a composite that has a long name, but that has an acronym called AMPA in French. I can tell you that it persists as long as glyphosate, and it persists just as long. So if I had a recommendation as a chemist, we don't do any analysis in New Brunswick. We don't know if there's glyphosate in our ground, in our soil, in our water. We just don't know. So if it was one of our recommendations, would be to start measuring it. It's part of the federal mandate to do it, but glyphosate is not part of its mandate currently. So we'd have to measure glyphosate and also measure AMPA, the first byproduct of degradation. It comes from glyphosate and it's just as toxic and persistent as glyphosate, according to what I've read. Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to Mrs. Conroy. You have 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Céline and Luc, for your presentation today. And to the interpreter also, I'm going to ask my question in English.
Well, you're with the research of Dr. Gilles, Eric, Dr. Céline, Eric Céline. I can't listen to myself and talk at the same time. Did she hear that?
C'est la question? Oui.
That's the question? Yes. Yes, a little. Dr. Céline has done studies on the effects of glyphosate on health, and notably cancer in France. His studies are controversial because the methodology of the studies is under question. So I would leave it at that.
And what his take on glyphosate would be?
I'm not sure of his specialty specifically. He's a university professor. He's certainly trained in health. I'm not sure if he's a physician or an epidemiologist. His studies tend to show that there is a connection between glyphosate and cancer. His studies were among the most publicized that demonstrated that connection, but his studies were also criticized because of his methodology. It's not a traditional epidemiologic methodology, so there were issues with the comparisons between the exposed population and the non-exposed population, and this is what was criticized from a literary standpoint. But since that time, other studies with better methodology that have, or that are starting to demonstrate the connection. But like we said in the presentation, there is no scientific consensus. So there are studies that demonstrate a link between cancer and other studies that do not. So one of the issues we have in epidemiology and exposures is that when you study wide swaths of population, especially in agricultural sectors, it's not just glyphosate that's being used. So we're finding ourselves faced with a mix of pesticides, and that's what makes it difficult to see just the issue with glyphosate and its effects on health. And I hope that answers your question.
Very much. Some researchers don't consider adjuvants and emulsifiers that make up 60% of most glyphosate products. In your professional opinion, how helpful or realistic would this type of research be in the impacts that, that glyphosate have on the forest in New Brunswick?
En effet, il y a peu d'études.
Indeed, there are very few studies that have examined commercial products. So the specific mix of ingredients that is being applied to our soils. So many studies have focused strictly on the active ingredient, which is glyphosate, and did not take into consideration the additives that are included. One thing I've seen in the literature is that adjuvants can be very toxic, and this is part of that package that we're exposed to in these commercial products. We're exposed to everything that's in that commercial product. So when we look at studies that are examining commercial products, we'll see more effects. When we compare glyphosate to commercial products, there's a tendency to have epidemiologic studies that are significant. So you'll see an effect more often than when you study just glyphosate, but there are still studies that still show effects with just glyphosate. So that's a major issue. And this explains the debate and the absence of consensus for regulatory bodies. So are we considering just the active agent or the mix? So this is an area where we can act to protect the population. So I found that in 2005, there was a study that was done in Canada. The title is Roundup with Adjuvants Can Boost Toxicity. So it can be toxic, but glyphosate is still more toxic. The company wants glyphosate to be as effective as possible, but don't forget that the company is selling glyphosate to kill plants. The company will create a formula to ensure that it's as effective as possible. But we can't forget that effective means toxic.
Studies being done, in the soil and in the water of glyphosate, and that was one of my questions, was if there is regular testing done. Has there been any testing done? I know there's not enough, obviously, but has there been any testing done? And when, if there was, when was the last time that it's been tested? Or that you know?
Donc, moi, j'ai fait des...
So I have made some requests with Environment Canada to get some data. In the past, before 2011, there was a program that was more ambitious for pesticides in Canada. New Brunswick was part of the program. We weren't testing glyphosate. That we never did. There were a few sites that were tested. So many pesticides were tested, but it wasn't glyphosate. I was told that since 2011, some samples were taken on a single site in New Brunswick, and glyphosate was not measured there. The fact that we don't have enough information, I can't tell you anything about glyphosate, but it seems that there is no public data about concentrations of glyphosate in New Brunswick.
Very concerning. It seems it should, especially with the outcry of support from, the public and the concern from the public, you would think that it would be, on the top of the list. Dr. Villard worked for the UDM. Are you familiar with any kind of his research, and can you tell us about it, if you are?
Moi, je peux commencer.
I can start. Dr. Villard is from University of Moncton. It's a small university. He worked in another department, the biology department. And I'd say that I know very little about his work. I know what he was working on. I know he works on birds. He's a bird specialist that has worked on the effects of the forest management and its effects on biodiversity and landscapes. And he focused mainly on birds because they're his specialty. Otherwise, I know that he did get funding from an Irving program at a certain point in time. I read about it in the media like everyone else, but I don't know much more about it than that. I could add something about the work of Mr. Villard, is that he was a landscape specialist, a forest, landscape, and ecosystem expert. And what he was showing is that the population of birds changed according to the forestry practices in place. So Mr. Villard focused mainly on forest management and not so much on the practice of spraying glyphosate. I think you've had some witnesses who have given you a similar message in the last few days. So this question of forest management and its effect on biodiversity shows clearly that there is an effect on bird populations. Mr. Villard's research gives you about the same information as you saw with the biology professor who presented yesterday.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Welcome. Next up, we have MLA Bacchus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you both for appearing today. I will be asking my questions in English, and thank you to the translator. Professor Surette, you had indicated or stated that the presence of glyphosate was found in urine in studied populations. Can you tell us where those populations were from?
Yes. They were located all over the place. There were many in the United States, some in Latin America and in Europe. As far as I know, there were none in Canada.
You indicated that there was occupational exposure in agricultural workers, higher concentrations. You suggested it was from, and maybe I got it wrong, from eating the food. Would it not have been perhaps from improper handling?
Non, oui, oui. Donc ça c'est.
Occupational exposure comes from applying the pesticides, but environmental exposure generally is considered, it's not only from what we eat, but mainly from what we eat. So we have to make the difference there. Maybe I wasn't clear enough because we're going very quickly.
Yes, you were. Thank you, though. And also, too, one of the recommendations was independent research. What would that cost? Quick answer. What would that cost? How long would it take? And who would do it here in New Brunswick?
Je pense ça dépend qu'est-ce qu'on veut comme.
So it depends what we want in terms of research. So first off, I think we need to start by measuring glyphosate in the environment. So that's the first thing to do. We don't do it, and because there's a cost for analysis.
And for the research?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oui.
Do you have an idea of how much it would cost? Are we talking $1 million? Are we talking 100,000? Are we talking 6 months of work?
Si on fait des études.
So for environmental studies, maybe it would be around $100,000, and it would take about 1 year because we would need to see the seasonal impacts. If we need to look at health impacts, it would require more money and also more time because it takes more time to conduct epidemiological studies. And that's the issue, right?
Do those studies?
Avec des collaborateurs.
With collaborators.
Mr. Holland.
Merci. Et aussi, je posais mon question.
I'm also going to ask my question in English today.
First, begin with the section that talked about natural water contamination and where it talks about toxicity for aquatic species such as algae and amphibians. Yesterday we had two presentations, one from Dr. Curry and one from Dr. Edge. Dr. Curry indicated that the herbicides does not inhibit algae growth, and Dr. Edge gave us two presentations on aquatic exposure and amphibian mortality, and he had done a study, Thompson et al. 2014, Edge et al. 2012, where we were given some New Brunswick data that shows toxicity at 850 milligrams per liter, but with the testing that they had done through overspraying wetlands and water areas, the maximum level of milligrams per liter that they could get at the point of spraying was 330, and then within 14 days it was inert. So when I see that where you're talking about the toxicity from Annette et al., can you help me reconcile those two different perspectives, especially where one of them is a New Brunswick example?
Euh,
I can't hear.
Ton micro, Luc.
Your mic, please. Oh, I'm sorry. So unfortunately, no, I cannot help you because when I did my literature review, I did not find those data. So the contaminant impacts on animals, that's not my area of expertise. So yes, you bring up a good point, and it seems that there's a contradiction, and there are many contradictions in the literature. That's what we're noticing. Some studies are saying yes, some studies are saying no. But honestly, I saw this often. So you say that glyphosate is not toxic for algae. Well, it must depend on the types of algae that's studied, because it's clear that if there's an algae that uses the metabolic pathway for amino acids, so that pathway that I talked about it during my presentation, so the algae that will use this pathway will have acute impacts, that's clear. So do all the other algae use this metabolic pathway? I'm not sure, but I cannot help you more than that.
Go to the human health component, where I want to get baselines for the data about the studies, no or few studies on the risk of glyphosate use in forest, but Dr. Surette, you found information in Colombia. Now, we have baselines for concentration levels, applications, et cetera, and guidelines, but in Colombia, what was the concentration levels? What was the exposure levels that led to the dermatological problems, respiratory diseases? Do you have something so that we can create a baseline as to what that comparison would be between Colombia and New Brunswick?
L'étude,
So the study that I saw in Colombia did not measure the exposure. So what this study did is that it looked at places where there was an aerial spraying of glyphosate, and then it would combine data in the hospital sector. So where the area was where it was sprayed, we would go in hospitals, and then they would look at the number of medical consultations for skin issues and respiratory disease, and the data on miscarriage in hospitals. So there's no exposure data. And then what I saw in a study where we would measure the concentration of glyphosate in urine for those workers who were in environments where there was aerial spraying, the concentration of glyphosate in urine was much higher when there was aerial spraying and when people were not exposed to aerial spraying. So I do not have the numbers with me right now, but I can find them later and provide them later on.
So the list of other chemicals that would have been applied within that rural region, as well as, do you have the concentration level of liter per hectare that would have been used in that Colombian study for aerial spraying?
je pense que ça fait partie de...
I think it's part of the science articles, so I can certainly send you those data.
Urine, we'll switch over to that. This is just an uninitiated question, and forgive my ignorance, but in the event that we find chemicals of any form in our urine, isn't that a sign that our body's filtration system is actually working? Do you have, and moving that product through, is there studies that would show concentration levels of deposits, though, as it relates to chemicals within, not within the urinary tract, but within the organ system? Because, you know, I just was thinking, you know, that's the body's purpose is to move product through. I'd be more concerned about studies that show deposits. Do you have any information on that?
No.
No, other than to say that urine is often used as an indicator of exposure for pesticides. So it's normal because it's the first biofluid that was used for glyphosate. And it's true, if we find glyphosate in our urine, it means that our body is eliminating it. But it's also an indicator that it goes through the intestinal barrier and that we can find it in our blood and that it will go through our body. So, it's more difficult to see the deposits in our organs. We would need to use biopsy tools or...
One more quick
sorry.
question, I think, for Dr. Tremblay. When there's studies that show that it binds minerals in the soil, is there studies that show that, okay, that binds that and then of course it prevents them from providing the enrichment to the soil, but are those bonds broke down as the chemicals deplete? And then do the minerals return back to their original form in the soil? Or does that alter the composition of them completely?
OK, ça c'est une question très intéressante.
Okay, so this is a very interesting question. I'm not sure if it was studied in detail, but for environmental chemistry and what I know about it, it's possible that glyphosate can be associated to grain minerals that are in the soil, and it seems that this binding will make it so that it's not so depleted as quickly. The soil will stabilize the glyphosate, and it's not going to be so easily degradable. Afterwards, it will be degraded, and if there's a degradation, the minerals that bind it to glyphosate will be available again. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank the University of Moncton and the presenters for being here today. We really appreciate you weighing in on this very important topic. Would you like to say any parting words to the members?
Merci beaucoup de l'opportunité.
Thank you for the opportunity that you provided us. Thank you. And I hope that our humble contribution and our expertise will help you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Since